Welcome back, gamers. Welcome back to the show. And we got my man Alex on the show.
How's it going?
And today's a very special show. We're going to be talking about the Sega Dreamcast because the date that this video is uploaded, hopefully, if all the stars align, it is 9/9/2024, and we're celebrating 25 years since the North American release of the Sega Dreamcast. Now, we got some Japanese games here. As us gamers know, the Dreamcast was released in 1998 in Japan, but we're Americans, and we don't call it the Sega Mega Drive, we call it the Sega Genesis. But we're not talking about the Genesis, we're talking about the Dreamcast. To celebrate 25 years of the North American release of the Sega Dreamcast, 9/9/99, we're going to be talking about our 9 favorite Sega Dreamcast games.
That's right, 9 games that we think not only define the Dreamcast, but define some of our favorite games from that generation.
So, me and Alex here, we don't really remember the launch of the Sega Dreamcast. In fact, thinking back to my early childhood, like before I was 10 years old, I really don't think I remember anybody having a Sega Dreamcast. I do remember playing a lot of the great Sega Dreamcast games in the arcade. Games like House of the Dead 2 and Crazy Taxi and Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Classic games all around.
I got my Dreamcast in 2011, and I really fell in love with the Dreamcast because I discovered that this is a console with a lot of the great arcade games that I grew up playing in the early 2000s, and we're going to go through some of those today when we talk about our top 9 favorite Dreamcast games. So we're going to start off with an all-time classic, Crazy Taxi, baby. Ooh. Alex, what do you got to say about Crazy Taxi?
Oh, man. What don't I got to say about Crazy Taxi? This is probably one of my favorite arcade games of all time. I was almost tempted to say arcade racing game, but this isn't really a racing game. Well, theoretically. I'd say you're more so racing against the clock more than anything. But I think what makes this game so enticing to come back to, even so many years after the fact, is just how addictive it is. It's very easy to pick up and play. The premise is simple. You're a taxi cab, and you just gotta pick up the customers, get them to their destination as fast and as crazy as possible. Probably one of the best AM2 games of all time, honestly. I mean, there's some pretty good competitors today. I think we're going to be talking about one of them later in a minute.
I also have a copy of Crazy Taxi here. I, unfortunately, have the Sega All-Stars version because I'm not as good of a person as Alex is. Actually, I just got this from the same game store I bought my Dreamcast from, the Play and Trade. This is one of the first Dreamcast games I ever bought. One of the reasons I fell in love with the Dreamcast back in the early 2010s is because a lot of the stuff was very cheap. The console was cheap. The accessories were cheap. Games like Crazy Taxi were cheap. Crazy Taxi probably is still a pretty reasonably affordable game. So to all the new Dreamcast collectors out there, I'm sorry you're getting into it now.
Well, to be fair,
you were born too late. But this is one you could probably still get very affordably.
I feel like, to be fair, there are multiple ways to play Crazy Taxi today. There's the various ports that have been made to the likes of the PS3, Xbox 360 through the Dreamcast collection. It's a very odd collection. I always forget that exists. But Crazy Taxi has also had multiple digital ports on Steam, on Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, and now you can also play Crazy Taxi on your mobile phones.
Yeah, my girlfriend plays Crazy Taxi on the phone. This is a game your girlfriend can play. So I think that says a lot about it. I'm not quite as good at Crazy Taxi as Alex is. I don't practice it as much. I'm more of a casual Crazy Taxi enjoyer. You know, I pick up and play it for 5 minutes. I never got that good, but it's a really fun pick up and play game. It was released on other various consoles at the time, like the PS2 and the GameCube. But the original Dreamcast version is the way to play it because you get that original soundtrack, and the Crazy Taxi arcade game runs on the Naomi arcade hardware, which is basically a Sega Dreamcast. So if you want the most authentic way to play it, you gotta go with the Sega Dreamcast original.
Most definitely.
What do you think about the new Crazy Taxi game that's going to come out?
You know what? cautiously optimistic. I think it's a game that I am very happy to see in the modern age. I think the direction that they're going in, people tend to say that it might be a bit misguided. I remember initial comments that Sega made that saying that they wanted to make a live service. I think the phrasing was super game, something along those lines, a bit of a silly term. But basically they wanted like the Fortnite audience or whatever, which does not bode too well for modern...
It's not a good sign.
Yeah, no, it's for old fans of Crazy Taxi. It doesn't sound like a good sign. But
keep your Fortnite on my Crazy Taxi. Also, it doesn't really seem like the same audience.
You know what? I think the audience isn't the same, but I think the direction of going for an online game, I think it makes the most sense. Crazy Taxi's always been a game that's been fairly competitive, and I think putting that into a multiplayer scenario where a lot of people are going against each other, trying to get higher scores, more taxi fares than the other players, I think that can offer some pretty interesting gameplay quirks. So I'm, again, cautiously optimistic. I'm hoping the game to be good. You know, I don't want it to be bad.
Yeah, I'm also cautiously optimistic, but, you know, I just have that creeping bad feeling that, you know, I know we got a stinker coming. But I hope to God, I hope to Jesus that it's a good game. And that we all get to have fun playing a new Crazy Taxi game. Let's go to our next pick. Alex, what do you think our next pick should be?
My next pick is a title I'm not too sure if you're familiar with, but it's a game that I want to talk about. It was one of the games that I remember really wanting for the Dreamcast for a long time. So much so that getting an English copy of this game was kind of difficult, but the Japanese copy, while just as expensive, was not absurdly as expensive. And that is Cannon Spike, also known as...
You don't think I know about Cannon Spike? You're making me look like I'm not a real gamer.
I'm saying I know you don't... I don't know if you played it.
I don't own a copy of Cannon Spike. I did burn a copy once, and I played it a little bit at our local arcade, the Galloping Ghost. I think it's a very fun game. I would like to play it more. I haven't played it enough to put it on my own personal list, but here on this list, we're kind of doing a mix of some of my favorite games and some of Alex's favorite games to give you the best of both worlds, the best Sega Dreamcast games.
That's right, and Cannon Spike, or Gun Spike as it was known in Japan. I don't know, I mean, was it censorship? You can't say gun. I mean, this was 1990, it was after Columbine.
Columbine, you can't say gun. I actually have a little nephew, and he goes to school, and they aren't allowed to say gun. So when they have toy guns, they have to call them blasters.
I was not aware of this.
Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing, but then I would try to say blaster in front of him, but then I just started saying gun, and then he says gun, and it's like, are we going to pretend like guns don't exist?
No, yeah, Gun Spike, Cannon Spike, whatever you want to call it. This is a really great game. I always tend to forget that it wasn't directly developed by Capcom. It was actually a Psycho game. These guys are fairly well known for a lot of shoot-'em-ups back in the day. I really do like this game. This was a game I remember looking at a lot on YouTube and various gaming websites just because I had never seen a game like it. It's a bit of a top-down shooter, not a twin-stick shooter. After all, the Dreamcast only has one analog stick, but it does have a multi-directional shooter kind of gameplay, and it also gives a lock function, so even if you wanted to shoot in one direction, you could hold the lock in order to aim precisely at your enemies. There's also a bomb function, lots of special maneuvers specific to each character. This game is actually very unique because you can actually play as the likes of Cammy, as well as Nash, I believe is his name, Charlie Nash.
Nash or Charlie, depending on who you ask.
Some people may even say that Charlie is Guile's brother. I don't know how true that is.
It's also got the Ghosts and Goblins guy, Arthur.
Oh, of course, right? Arthur, man. Yeah, Arthur is a cool unlockable character. You know who's also unlockable in here? Mega Man. Ooh. And now Mega Man's going to be appearing on the new Funko Pop game, coming out soon to a game console near you.
I don't have a copy of that game. I'm quite jealous of Alex's copy. I think I would like to pick myself up a copy one of these days.
One of the things...
When I have an extra $100 to throw at a cool Japanese
that's
video
the issue
game.
here, isn't it? One of these games, the Dreamcast library as a whole has a lot of prime titles that are so well recognized, but some of the more sought after titles have only been increasing in price. It hasn't gotten any particularly easier, and I felt like the best option for me for a lot of these games was getting the Japanese version. I think Cannon Spike is relatively playable without any English knowledge whatsoever, but this is still a pretty hefty price to pay for such a beloved game. But definitely a worthwhile check if you manage to play it one of these days. Hopefully Capcom will release a collection that includes Cannon Spike.
They'll have to re-release Cannon Spike, but I'm going to want that original Dreamcast copy because it's just something else to have the Dreamcast original, especially for those arcade games developed with the Naomi hardware. You want to get those original Dreamcast versions.
And as I was saying before, again, it was developed by Saikyo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that title correctly, but they've done a lot of great games in the past. Sengoku Aces, the likes of Gunbird 2, which was also published by Capcom, and they're fantastic game on the Dreamcast, which I unfortunately do not have a copy of. But you can play a lot of those games on the Saikyo collection. Not particularly perfect ports of those games, but definitely worth looking into if you just want to check them out. Maybe even probably emulation. I don't know if that's a word that we can utter here in this video.
Oh, I'm very pro emulation. I would be pro burning games on your Dreamcast to play them for free, because some games are prohibitively expensive. I don't want any of you young kids going out there and spending $100 on video games for one single old video game that maybe you might not even like.
It's true.
So I would definitely recommend trying before you buy. One of the things that got me into Dreamcast is that at the time that I got into collecting it, a lot of the stuff was very cheap. Not all of it was cheap. It had its expensive games, but I could get a lot of games in the $10, $20, $25. At that time, $30 to $60 felt like a lot to spend on an old video game. But now that's actually like a fair price for a good old video game. So, you know,
I mean, it's especially true if we're playing about the speculation market, which I think has kind of ruined retro game collecting as a whole. It's like now you have to imagine, well, is this game that I'm buying now going to be expensive down the line? Should I just buy it now if I want to own a physical copy at some point? Especially if it doesn't have a multi-platform release where you can easily get it on PC. It's just kind of the nature of what the market is now. Everyone's trying to sort of FOMO their way into getting a lot of these old physical games, not really realizing that it's usually the anti-consumer practices of these companies that just kind of make it harder to enjoy these games without having to force ourselves to go through hacking or emulation as the answer. It's kind of unfortunate.
It's unfortunate, but you know, that's a whole can of worms for another video for another day. The next game on our top 9 Dreamcast games is House of the Dead 2.
Ooh.
This is a game that me and Alex grew up playing in the arcade back in the day. We were very lucky. Where we used to play House of the Dead, we used to go to Hollywood Park in the Chicagoland area, and we would play House of the Dead 1 and 2. I remember playing it when I was a little kid with my older brothers, and this is just a perfect pick-up and play game, because all you need to do to play it is, here, I have a Dreamcast light gun. I actually have 2, so here, you can hold one. This is a little bit lame compared to the arcade gun, but they made these phasers to kind of look like Star Trek phasers, because remember, as we said earlier, you know, this was the time of Columbine, so they didn't want to have actual, like, gun-looking accessories. And even nowadays, like, what happened to light guns? I mean, I know we can't do it with TVs anymore, but there's got to be some kind of technology to do it with flat-screen TVs. I just don't think game companies want to sell these to us anymore. They can sell us Call of Duty games every year, but they don't want to sell us...
Well, I think the issue is that for a lot of people, the novelty of peripherals aren't really in the minds of many gamers today. Everyone just kind of wants their games to look realistic, maybe be a live service, online multiplayer. But the light gun is a bit of an archaic but very unique piece of technology. I think that even without cathode ray tube televisions, we'd still be able to attempt doing something like that. I mean, a perfect example of this was the Nintendo Wii. Now, you just had the sensor bar on the Wii remote, but unfortunately, I think the closest thing that we can kind of get to that in the modern age, especially with the recent HD remake of House of the Dead 1, which is a game that never had a proper
I forgot
release.
that existed.
Yeah, it's a really weird game, and if you wanted to sort of imitate the light gun experience, you would have to use the gyro motion in your controller.
I remember being excited that they were going to remake House of the Dead, and then it came out, and I never played it. It's awkward.
It's pretty interesting.
You played it? You bought it?
I have not bought it. It looks very odd. Not particularly well favorable to the general aesthetic of that release.
It would be cool if they just re-release the arcade game on modern consoles. Is that too much to ask for?
I think kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, that's why we have Sega Dreamcasts. So we can play House of the Dead. This is a game you can just pick up and play. It's one of the earliest games I remember going to Hollywood Park as a kid. And how do you play it? It's simple. You have a gun, you shoot the zombies. It doesn't get any more simple than that. Games like House of the Dead and Time Crisis were just some of the best games in the arcade because anybody could pick up and play them. They're probably some of the first games a lot of kids would play because of how simple it is.
That's true. I feel like whenever I think of old school retro games in the arcade, I generally just think to a lot of the light gun games that were available. It wasn't anything too particularly technical other than just point and shoot. And maybe that was a possible fear of a lot of parents and maybe even publishers back in the day, especially with situations like Columbine, where it's like, oh, we don't want to sell a game where we're encouraging kids to pick up guns and shoot. But, I mean, they were simple, goofy little games. I mean, people play Grand Theft Auto. Are they going out murdering mass murdering people?
Some of them probably statistically are, but a majority of them statistically aren't. You know, I grew up playing GTA and mowing people down and driving around in Liberty City, and well, I'm actually a very careful driver, and I would really never want to run anyone over. Another great way to experience House of the Dead on the Sega Dreamcast is Typing of the Dead.
Ooh.
Now this game, let me pull out one of my accessories.
Oh.
You need a Sega Dreamcast keyboard to play it. This is a great way to practice typing, guys. But you do need to buy a Sega Dreamcast keyboard. And nowadays, this game has gone prohibitively expensive. Back in my day, back when I was in high school, I bought this game, and I think I got the game with this keyboard. I forgot how much money it was, but it was like maybe $30 or $40 for both of them together. Might have even been as cheap as like $25. And I was taking a typing class, so in high school I convinced my mom. I was like, Mom, if you buy me this, it'll help me with my typing class. So I was convincing my mom to buy me retro games.
Another thing to note about Typing of the Dead is that it's also available for the PC. So even though this game's not widely available on a lot of platforms, because let's be honest, we're not connecting keyboards to our PS5s, even though you technically can. It'd be kind of cool to see a game like that come out nowadays, but it is technically abandonware, so if you know where to look, you can definitely get a copy of Typing of the Dead. It's actually one of my mom's favorite PC games.
You know it's a good game if even the moms are playing it. Come on. This is mom core gaming at its core. And if you pick up one of these Dreamcast keyboards, you can even play Quake 3 Arena with it. Pretty good port of Quake 3 Arena is on the Dreamcast, especially considering the time that it came out. Now, is it good enough to make it onto our top 9 list? No, but I'm giving a shout out to the Sega Dreamcast port of Quake 3 Arena right now. And also Unreal Tournament's on there too, but I don't like that as
since
much.
We're still talking about the Dreamcast keyboard here, real quick, I believe you could also use it to type to your friends on Phantasy Star Online.
Oh, that'd be cool if I would have been cool to play Phantasy Star Online on the Sega Dreamcast and actually play it online. I know you can still do it, but those broadband adapters are awfully expensive.
Yeah, but you know what is also expensive is the alternative option, which is playing Phantasy Star Online on your Nintendo GameCube with the extremely rare GameCube keyboard controller.
Anyway, Alex, what's your next choice for our top 9 greatest Dreamcast games?
Well, since it just got announced for the Volume 2 of the Capcom Classics Collection, in a game series that I never thought we would ever see again come back to the public zeitgeist, I want to talk about none other than Power Stone. Wonderful game. This is another Japanese copy that I acquired actually for relatively cheap. I want to say around $30. I got this at a local game store that we frequent in the Chicago area, and I just had to get this game alongside the sequel, Power Stone 2. But I'm picking Power Stone 1 specifically as it feels much more of a concentrated game. Power Stone 2 is a tad bit more simplified. I mean, these games are relatively simple in nature, but I feel like there's a little bit more complexity to some of the move sets in the original Power Stone. It's more focused on a 1v1 sort of scenario. And I find this to be a much more engaging game to be played with a 2-player, but 4 players is also pretty cool with Power Stone 2.
Yeah, the Power Stone series on Dreamcast is a really great party game. I feel like it's a really great game if you're having a Dreamcast game night and you're having the homies over. Power Stone, I feel like you can't really go wrong with.
Yeah, and Power Stone 1, it's still a great game to look back on. I believe this was a launch title for the Dreamcast in America.
I believe it was a launch title in America, not in Japan, because they only had 4 launch titles. That Godzilla game, the Ring game, Virtua Fighter 3 TB, and that Penguin ice racing game.
Oh, you mean the ever so classic? I have it over here, actually.
He actually has it. This mad lad.
Pen Triathlon.
A Japanese launch title, but I actually don't think it was part of the U.S. launch, which is kind of weird to think about.
That is odd, but maybe it was because it was too weird.
Too weird. I think they wanted to come out strong with games like Soul Calibur and House of the Dead 2.
Not to mention, this game was actually not even published by Sega themselves. It was actually published by Infogrames, who I believe was an Atari subsidiary. I forget, but don't really talk about those guys too much anymore now, do we?
No, we don't.
For good reason. But you know what we do talk about even today? Power Stone. Again, gotta love this game. Gotta love this game series as a whole. I'm very happy that a new generation of gamers will finally be able to play Power Stone that isn't exclusive to the PlayStation Portable, which is the last time we actually saw Power Stone.
It's been that long.
It has been that long, and it's kind of frustrating.
If you think about it, that wasn't even that long after the Dreamcast version. Was that like 6 years later, 7
Roughly
years
so,
later?
but like, not even like a PS2 or an Xbox release. I mean, come on, man.
What were they thinking?
What were they thinking? And, hopefully, with this game now coming back into resurgence, maybe we'll see a Power Stone 3?
I think that's wishful thinking. But
Maybe
hey,
you're right.
A man can dream.
A man can dream in the same way that a man can dream that Tatsunoko vs. Capcom will be released on modern platforms. But hey, keep on dreaming like the Dreamcast.
Hey, we can just cast those dreams away like Sega bass fishing.
So I've done my pick. What's your next pick for the top 9 Dreamcast games?
My next pick for the top 9 Dreamcast games of all time. And just so you guys know, this list isn't a subjective list. This is actually an objective list of these are the best. If you kind of disagree, you're wrong. Anyway, my next choice for the top 9 greatest Dreamcast games, of course, is Shenmue, a Yu Suzuki classic. This is the guy that brought us Hang On, Space Harrier, Outrun, Virtua Fighter, more games than you could shake a stick at.
Yeah, the man was truly prolific. And, it's kind of funny looking back at Shenmue 1, because this game was very prolific of what the industry would become in the grand scheme of things. Very expensive game to produce back in the day, heavily focusing on realistic graphics, or at least realistic for the time, but this game still looks pretty good, despite the fact that achieving that
This
look.
game looks beautiful. I think in many ways, this game looks better than your AAA games that come out today. It has a beautiful atmosphere, a beautiful world for you to explore. Some people might call this a walking simulator, and they aren't wrong. Is it a perfect game? Is it the best Dreamcast game ever? No. But it is a quirky game, it is a fun game, it has a fun world to explore. Your character, Ryu, he actually has a Sega Saturn in his house, and if you collect enough gold soda cans, you can go to the convenience store and you can win Sega Saturn games to play on your Sega Saturn at Ryu's house. So then you can stop spending your money at the arcade in the game and you can just have those games to play anytime you want. So Shenmue is worth the price of admission just for the great ports of Hang On and Space Harrier. Well, nowadays you can also play those games in the Yakuza series, but at the time this was pretty much the best way to play Hang On. And also Space Harrier, but that was also on the Sega Saturn. But if you didn't have a Sega Saturn, this was the best way to play Space Harrier. So yeah, Shenmue, it's a great game, not just for the arcade ports, but for the great atmosphere. Anything you want to say about Shenmue, Alex?
I'll be honest when I say that I'm not too familiar with Shenmue. It's one of those games that has kind of been left blank in my gaming backlog repertoire. I have played a majority, if not all, the Yakuza games at this point, with the exceptions of some of the spin-offs. There are games that I've been meaning to go through for quite some time. I've only recently been going through them earlier this year, and I was hoping that after completing through the Yakuza games, I would go back to check out Shenmue at some point. I actually do have the HD collection on PS4, so hopefully that'll happen sooner than later. I do think it's interesting that we now live in a world where Shenmue 3 exists, but alas, Yu Suzuki's vision doesn't seem to particularly great in retrospect.
I never played Shenmue 3, but just hearing that it doesn't have the arcade games playable is just a punch in the gut. That alone is enough to kind of deter me.
I'll say this much. It's not even that alone that is particularly disappointing. It's that after years of waiting so long, I think the odd thing was that Sega wasn't particularly keen on supporting it. That was already kind of a red flag. But another addition to that was when the game did finally came out, it didn't really have much to say, like, at all. There was no continuation to the story of Ryu or any of the characters involved since Shenmue 1 or Shenmue 2, and I find that to be very unfortunate.
I think part of the reason of that is that Yu Suzuki wasn't really involved in too many games since the early 2000s, so maybe he, his prime era was kind of behind him, and maybe he just didn't have as much to say. I haven't played Shenmue 3. I wanted to play it, but I didn't have a new game console at the time that it came out, and then it just kind of fell by the wayside.
I do think it's worth noting that I think for many years, I think Yu Suzuki has already known how he's wanted to end Shenmue, but I think the original idea was that he wanted to make 8 sequels or something to that effect.
Yeah, it's like 15 games or something.
Something absurd like that, so maybe it's good that Yu Suzuki's not in the industry anymore, but to be fair, we have 8 Yakuza games, with maybe a 9th one coming up soon in the next couple weeks.
Who knows, maybe Shenmue 7 and 8 and Shenmue 10, maybe those would have been masterpieces and we're missing out on them. So, I hope Yu Suzuki, he's an old dude, but I hope he gets those games out one day.
In an alternate universe, we would be playing Shenmue 5, and Ryu would be holding a copy of Shenmue's Dreamcast case in 3D.
And you could play Shenmue in Shenmue.
And you would play it in VR.
You can create Shenmue Inception. I always thought the Pokemon games should do that. I think in the new Pokemon games, you should be able to get a Game Boy Color and play Pokemon Red and Blue on it.
Well, it's funny you say that, because do you know that in Shenmue 3, you can collect Gashapon characters of the characters from Shenmue?
That is pretty silly.
I think I would be very scared if I was Ryu and I saw a miniature version of myself in a quarter toy machine.
One of the things that I always thought was weird about Shenmue is that it's based in 1986, but your character has a Sega Saturn, and your brother has a Virtua Fighter poster on his wall, and you can go to the arcade, and, well, I guess the arcade games were 80s arcade games, but it was weird that he had a Sega Saturn. So anyway, that's enough talking about Shenmue. Let's move on to the next game on our top 9 list. Alex, what's your next pick?
Well, my next pick is actually a game you've been looking at for quite some time throughout this video, and that is Sonic Adventure 1. Now, bit of a controversial opinion to some Sonic heads out there. A lot of people seem to love Sonic Adventure 2. I am not a big fan of Sonic Adventure 2.
I never played Sonic Adventure 2. Don't shoot me, Sonic fans. I'm sorry.
Now, I'll have to say this. I respect the Sonic fanbase. I even call myself a bit of the part of the Sonic fanbase in a way. It's a game that I think I get into butting heads with a lot of Sonic fans. A lot of people tend to ask, which is the better game, Sonic Adventure 1 or Sonic Adventure 2? Sonic Adventure 2 seems like a more focused game, a lot more careful in its level design and moment-to-moment gameplay. However, I don't particularly like the fact that you switch between characters too often. I feel like that game has significantly more Eggman and Knuckles-esque stages throughout, whereas in Sonic Adventure 1, it's a lot more carefully focused on a character-to-character basis. I tend to always come back to the Sonic and Tails levels, even the Knuckles levels a lot. Those 3 in particular are some of my favorite characters in the game.
Yeah, I've only really played the Sonic levels, the Tails levels, and the Knuckles levels. I never got very far. I don't even think I really played any of the Amy levels. I think I played a little bit as that robot guy and the big cat.
Yeah, Gamma is a pretty cool character. I don't want to diss him too much because I said I kind of... I'm not too favorable to the Eggman stages in 2. But I think Gamma, his gameplay is actually pretty great in the original Sonic Adventure. I tend to like how fast he is in comparison to how Eggman and Tails feels, but I don't know, maybe I'm misremembering. I don't know, I've always tend to like Gamma more than I like Eggman or Tails in 2. But again, I find that the single character focus in these games tend to be why I favor Sonic Adventure 1, even with its open world premise, or rather hub world. A lot of people tend to sort of get pretty frustrated at the in-between sections of trying to get to the levels themselves because of the hub world. But I don't know, I think they're pretty quirky. I think they're pretty interesting to look back on. This was Sonic's first interpretation into 3D, or proper interpretation into 3D. I guess you could also look back on Sonic Jam on the Sega Saturn, which is probably
Sonic 3D Blast on the Sega Genesis.
Well, I wouldn't really count that.
Yeah, strangely enough, I was introduced to Sonic Adventure on a GameCube demo disc. I'm sure a lot of you early GameCube heads remember that GameCube demo disc. It had Soul Calibur 2 on it. GameCube demo had Emerald Coast, the first level with Sonic where he's running on the beach and you have the whale. So I got to see that iconic moment and play that level over and over again as a kid. I would also play the snowboarding level with Tails over and over, and I would play Red Mountain Zone with Knuckles, and I would also play as the robot and the cat guy a lot. But you only got one level for each guy, but in total that makes 6 levels, which is actually, that's a lot of gameplay, especially as a little kid. So I would play the Sonic Adventure demo over and over again. So I'm actually very nostalgic to Sonic Adventure, but I would just play the demo over and over. But it was a very vast demo.
I feel like a lot of people do a lot of disservice to Sonic Adventure 1 just because it was an early Sonic game. But going back to the original Dreamcast version, it actually says a lot with just how well designed that game is. A lot of the issues that would be seen in later revisions and ports of the game are not seen in that original Dreamcast release whatsoever. One of the more infamous ones being earlier on in Emerald Coast, you actually clip through one of the geometry and then you just fall to the floor and then you die immediately. But that is not seen at all in the original Dreamcast release. It's a very solid game overall, and I feel like a lot of people tend to discredit it too much. Maybe deservedly so for some of its more archaic level design choices, but I think it's a game that does not get enough credit to where it's due. And you know what, I'll even say that I do think Sonic Adventure 2 is a pretty decent game in its own right, but I think they're both great games in 2 completely different ways. But I think I prefer Adventure 1 more so in comparison to 2.
I do like Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. I got the Dreamcast version later on. Like I said, I grew up playing that GameCube demo over and over. But I did eventually get a Dreamcast copy, and I did play through all of the Sonic levels and a good majority of the Knuckles and Tails levels, but I only really finished the Sonic stages, and then I kind of had my fill. But I did like what I played of Sonic Adventure on the Sega Dreamcast. Should you think I should go back and play all of the levels?
Honestly, yeah. I think the Amy story, the Big the Cat, and Gamma stories are relatively short enough. I think Gamma is a lot more entertaining than I give him credit for, especially because I'm not too big of a fan of the Eggman stages. The Gamma stages are, I feel like, a lot more well thought out, platforming-wise, and level design and combat, whereas I think the Eggman and Tails stages in 2 were a bit tad slower for my liking. Again, maybe I'm just misremembering, but I feel like Amy's relatively short enough that it's not too of a dampering experience. And then Big the Cat's just basically like playing the likes of Sega Bass Fishing, which is, I mean, everyone loves Sega Bass Fishing.
So you would recommend I go back and beat it with all the characters, though?
I would, especially if you want to play one of the secret characters.
I didn't know there was a secret
There's
character.
one secret character.
Well, don't spoil it for me, my friend. Let's save it for when I play it.
It's been over 2 decades.
Well, hey.
I bet you're going to tell me
better late than never.
Who gets killed in Final Fantasy VII.
Well, that's on the back of the damn box, Alex. Yeah, I have a little nephew, and he likes the Sonic movies, so I got him to play the snowboarding level of Sonic Adventure, and he really liked it. So this is a game that 4-year-olds can play. This is a game that 5-year-olds can play. This is a game that 50-year-olds can play. Actually, I don't know if 50-year-olds really play it. Actually, I'm certain some of these YouTubers are.
I was going to say, I think when we turn 50, we'll still be looking back fondly on Sonic Adventure.
Okay, so for my second to final pick on our top 9 Sega Dreamcast games, I'm going with a tie between Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2
hey,
now.
Man, 2 choices. That's your second double choice of the evening. That's cheating, man.
Well, I could just put Tony Hawk 2, but I want to talk about Tony Hawk 1 as well because I love them both equally. They're both beautiful games.
I'll let it slide.
They both are best played on the Sega Dreamcast. I guess you could say that Tony Hawk's 2X on the Xbox is the best way to play Tony Hawk 2. After all, you do get all the levels from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1, but we're talking about the Dreamcast today.
You know what I will say? I think the interesting thing about the Dreamcast, it doesn't really get too often recognized, is that multi-platform releases were generally better on the Dreamcast. Great examples being the Tony Hawk 1 and 2 ports, but games like the likes of Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver was generally regarded as a bit of like a remaster or a remake of that original game. A lot of other games. Spider-Man, Shadow Man, a lot of Man games.
Graphically, these are the best looking versions of these two games.
You got the last gen design philosophies of the PlayStation 1, but you got the promising new hardware of the next generation, like the PS2.
Which is kind of what we got in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, which unfortunately never came to the Dreamcast. It's my dream that one day somebody will port Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 onto the Dreamcast.
I mean, it is on Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation. And the PlayStation also got Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4.
I would like to see a port of the 6th gen version of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 on the Sega Dreamcast because I know the Sega Dreamcast can do it, because when I look at these games, they look graphically on the same level as Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, but it's just the old game, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. This is one of the best ways you can play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. I would really recommend these games on PS1 as well. That's probably easier to find than these Dreamcast versions, but if you're a Dreamcast owner, I definitely recommend you burn these games or hunt down copies. I don't think they're as expensive as some other Dreamcast games. Probably cheaper to get it on PS1. But these versions on the Sega Dreamcast are supreme, beautiful versions of the games. Okay, gamers, so before we get to our number one best Dreamcast game, we're going to give you some honorable mentions. Some games that didn't quite make the top 9 for us, but they're definitely great games that we wanted to talk about in this video. So, Alex, what do you have for us to start us off?
I got a couple of games here. One of these games is actually going to be available in the upcoming Capcom Classics Collection 2 of all their classic fighting games, and that is the likes of Project Justice. Another Japanese version of a game. Again, a lot of the American releases just a tad bit too difficult to get your hands on, at least pricing-wise. Had to mention this one. Great fighting game.
Also, the first game on PS1 is also really good.
Which is great. I love that game, too. Very odd that it's not going to be on that collection, though. Kind of a weird fumble there.
Yeah, why are they releasing the second one but not the first? I wonder what the reasoning is.
You know what? I'm hearing rumors that because specifically a lot of those games are on the Sega hardware, like the Dreamcast
the
era.
Naomi, yeah.
That a lot of them are going to be focusing on Naomi hardware, and that PS1 game is, of course, the PS1 hardware.
Well, maybe we'll get another collection with the more PS1-centric Capcom games like Street Fighter EX 1 and 2 and Rival Schools. One can only hope.
Here's hoping, yeah.
I'm sure if people go out and buy these games, Capcom will start digging into their
let's be real,
libraries.
If they're already making a Volume 2 before Marvel vs. Capcom collection even comes out, I'm starting to think that they made a lot of money from that collection, or even the previous collection. I mean, they've come out pretty consecutively close with one another. I'm thinking they have some games they've been holding out for quite some time. I think it's about damn time.
It's time to release the floodgates. It's time to release the games.
Anyways, I don't want to ramble too much more about that game because we're going to be hearing more about it once it releases again. But another game, had to mention, Sega Bass Fishing. Classic arcade game. I also have the Sega fishing controller. I don't have it with me, unfortunately, somewhere around here, but definitely a unique controller. It's got motion sensors, so when you cast your fishing rod, it's like you're actually doing it in real life. It's super realistic.
Casting your fishing rod, Dreamcast. Another good fishing game is Sega Marine Fishing for the Sega Dreamcast.
Another game that I also have as well. Actually, some people may even consider the preferred game to have. I think they're both good in their own way.
I imagine in a perfect world you have both games.
Of course.
Whichever one you can get your hands on, gamers.
Especially if you already have the fishing controller. I mean, might as well get more use out of that thing, right?
Sega Bass Fishing's also on all the modern... Well, it's on the Xbox. I think it's on PS3 as well.
It's on PS3. It's also on PC. And it's even in the recent release of the most recent Yakuza game, Yakuza Infinite Wealth.
It was also on the Wii, but that version was kind of different.
I've actually never played the Wii version, so I don't know how different that one is.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Those Sega fishing games, that's another game that my girlfriend likes to play. So, guys, these are games you can play with your GF. It's games for everybody.
I wouldn't know.
What's your final honorable mention before we go to my honorable mentions?
My last honorable mention is a rather obscure game in the minds of many Western gamers. This was a Japanese-only release, which is quite unfortunate. It's also one of the more unique Dreamcast releases. This is around the tail end of the Dreamcast's life in Japan. There's a handful of other games like this, but this is the one that I own in particular. This is Cosmic Smash on the Sega Dreamcast by Sega Rasa. Are you familiar with Cosmic Smash?
No, but that's a very unique case.
It is. Like I said, it's almost shaped like a modern game case today.
DVD case.
DVD case, kind of like the PS2.
Oh, but it's on the other side.
Yeah.
Kind of like the Xbox One.
Why?
One and done. Well, that's the only other console I've seen that put the disc on that side.
You know, I've never noticed that.
Yeah.
In any case, Cosmic Smash is a pretty interesting game. I forget what it's called. Racquetball, the game where you're playing tennis with or wall ball, or
I don't know.
I don't know what the proper name for that sport is, but essentially you're sort of, it's like Pong. It's single player Pong. Instead of fighting against an AI opponent, you're actually trying to clear out a set of tiles, and you have to sort of carefully navigate your ball against the wall, against these tiles, and it's a pretty addictive little arcade game. It's a game that I think visually looks reminiscent to another Dreamcast original title known as Rez, which is a fantastic sort of action shooting rhythm game. But Cosmic Smash is a bit more of a classic style tennis, wall ball, Pong, Arkanoid-esque game. Multiple pathways you can even choose. Very odd, but very addictive in nature.
I'd kind of want to pick that game up. It looks cool in the DVD case. I'd like to pick up... Was there other Dreamcast games released in the DVD style case?
There was.
I know there was indie games released after the Dreamcast.
Yes, there were.
I'm not counting those. I'm talking about Japanese, like, official...
One of them in particular, I believe, is Under Defeat, which was a popular, or maybe not popular, but a pretty well-respected shooter on the Dreamcast. I actually had the PS3 release of it, known as Under Defeat HD, but it did release on the Dreamcast, and it did release in a DVD box set. I believe it also included the soundtrack, if I remember correctly.
I would like some of those DVD case Dreamcast games, because that's an interesting curiosity. But it does bother me a little bit that it doesn't fit on the shelf with your other Dreamcast games.
It is a bit odd, I will admit, but it is an interesting talking point whenever people see it. They're like, oh, what game is that? I'm like, oh, this is Cosmic Smash.
It is unique. Well, I think it's time I talk about some of my honorable mentions.
What are your honorable mentions?
We're going to start out with a Dreamcast launch title. If you see a top 10 Dreamcast list, this is almost always going to be on it. And that's Soul Calibur, the classic. This whole series is really good. I love Soul Blade or Soul Edge in the arcade and on the PS1. The PS1 port is very accurate to the arcade game. It's almost a perfect arcade port if you look at them.
If I remember correctly, the original arcade release was a modified rendition of the PlayStation hardware. I believe it just had slightly enhanced RAM, but they're relatively on par with one another.
Yeah, I've looked at side-by-sides, and I know we're talking about PS1 game in a Dreamcast video, but I have looked at side-by-sides for Soul Blade in the arcade and Soul Blade on the PS1, and I can't tell the difference at all. And this is another great arcade port, but this time instead of being on the PS1, we got it on the Sega Dreamcast, and this actually looks even better than the arcade version.
Which is very crazy to think about. In the late 90s, this was very telling of what the future was going to be like in gaming. Back then, the arcade was very definitive of what the future of gaming would look like, but now, this was the home console setting the standard of what gaming would be in the future.
Yeah, the Dreamcast kind of represents the last era of truly great arcade games. We grew up in the early 2000s, and this was like the late 90s, 2000s era of arcade games. Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2, the House of the Dead series, Crazy Taxi. That's stuff you would see in the arcades in the 2000s. It was kind of the last era of arcade games. There were still arcade games after the Dreamcast era, but the Dreamcast kind of does represent the end of the truly great arcade.
You know what? I mean, you're pointing out a Namco game. I'm surprised you didn't bring up Time Crisis. Time Crisis 2, Time Crisis 3, 4.
Those are great arcade games of the 2000s as well. Those are some other games that were coming out in the 2000s, keeping the arcade scene alive.
Before the turn of the HD era, like, we still saw releases like Time Crisis 4 in the arcades, which was also released on the PS3. But, again, very telling, you know, at this time, home consoles were already starting to become quite definitive in the modern gaming market, that you would only really see arcade releases in Japan, and even then, while they're still generally present, they don't have much of an impact on where the industry goes these days.
And speaking of beautiful arcade ports, my other honorable mention is Dead or Alive 2. This is a very good port of the arcade game. This is just absolutely beautiful graphics. This was an early Dreamcast release, and it just looks absolutely stunning. I will say that the Xbox version looks better, but that came out a whole 5 years after this Dreamcast game, so it's not really a fair comparison. I would pick this up on either the Dreamcast or the original Xbox, whatever you can get your hands on. I will say that the Xbox version does still play on all of the newer Xbox systems, so that might be a more easily accessible game if you don't have a Dreamcast.
That is a good point. I will also note, well, not a particularly perfect port of the game. I'm not too sure what the technical differences are. I think it's mostly on performance side of things. This game was also available on the PlayStation 2, I believe. It was
only in Japan, I think.
No,
right?
It came out in America as well, if I remember correctly. It also had an American release, but I think the thing that became very definitive was that the Xbox port of that game, and even the Dreamcast port, were significantly better performance and visually speaking. But the Dreamcast port was one of the first ports of the game, and again, very beautiful game overall. I love the characters. I think a lot of people will look back at a game like Dead or Alive and probably go like, man, the graphics look kind of weird nowadays. The characters kind of look like, almost like, kind of like dolls, very plasticine looking. Games don't look like this anymore.
Yeah.
I think back in the day, this was like my vision of what the future gaming graphics looked like. They looked like very high quality, very distinct. A look that usually gets associated with the Y2K turn of the century.
The Y2K aesthetic.
The Y2K aesthetic, PS2 era. But I think it's also very definitive of the Dreamcast look, and I think DOA is a perfect example of the Y2K aesthetic, especially. Very beautiful game, and again, Tecmo, Team Ninja, fantastic developers, fantastic publishers. Heavily recommend Dead or Alive 2, and, you know, also Dead or Alive 1 on the Sega Saturn.
That's another great one.
Another great one.
Hey, while we're at it, Dead or Alive 3, too.
And you know what, while we're at it, Dead or Alive 4 on the 360.
And, you know, you should get that Xbox game that has Dead or Alive 1 and 2.
Yes.
If you have an Xbox, if you're an Xbox.
Well, if I remember correctly, that's technically one single release, but many people tend to sell only one half of that collection.
Well, that's kind of satanic because it does come in a box that has both of them in it. So to separate them,
it's like having,
just absolutely evil.
Yeah, it's like having a Reese's without the chocolate or the peanut butter. It's like, how are you going to do that?
Well, now, Alex, I think it's time we talk about our penultimate pick, our number one pick. Now, honestly, this list, I kind of consider this to be in no particular order, but I did want to finish off on this game because we're about to get a re-release of it on modern consoles. Thank the heavens, so many people have been waiting for a long time for us to get a re-release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Yeah, this was the game that I think many people have been waiting for. I think while this list was not done in any particular order, I think we both agreed we wanted to save this game last. I mean, games like Power Stone recently got announced for a new remaster and such, but I think the one game that many people thought would be the impossible re-release due to a lot of the licensing catastrophe going behind the scenes with Disney, was Marvel vs. Capcom. But I guess in recent years, with the success of fighting game franchises like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter 6, even Guilty Gear getting a next wave of popularity, and of course, games like Tekken have retained a lot of positivity over the years. Marvel vs. Capcom 2. We have not seen this game in a long, long time. Last time we'd seen this game proper was a digital release on the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Arcade. Unfortunately, will later end up getting delisted, and we have not seen the game since, and it has become a relatively sought-after game. Even generally regarded poor ports of the game, like the PS2 iteration, tend to go for upwards of 100 or more, just because of how much people want to play this game again in a convenient fashion.
Yeah, this Dreamcast copy is worth well over $100. I'm hoping that the price goes down when this re-release comes out so more people can get their hands on the classic Dreamcast version. I was lucky to pick this game up before it was prohibitively expensive. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is one of the greatest fighting games of all time. It's got a huge roster. Nowadays, they would never give us a roster like this without making us pay for DLC. So, thank the fighting game gods. I thought they weren't going to release it because I didn't think Capcom would want to show us that they could give us this many characters in a game without making us pay for DLC. Granted, a lot of this was copy and pasting of sprites from all the previous Capcom games that all of these characters appeared in, but it's still epically awesome to get all of these characters in one game.
I think it's also worth noting that, like you said, there's a lot of asset reusage going on in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, but I don't think a lot of people would look down on that back in the day. I feel like in the modern age of gaming, so many people have this perception that games need to have not only super realistic graphics, but God forbid if you use the old character models from your previous release. That is like a sin in modern gaming that the young kids just don't want to see. I don't know how any of these kids could play a game like Marvel vs. Capcom 2 with that mental philosophy going on, especially with games like Yakuza that have the tendency of reusing assets over and over and over again per entry. It's sacrilege to them, but I think back in the day it was a necessary evil, especially when it gave us fantastic games like Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Marvel vs. Capcom 2 has a great roster. It has a great selection of Capcom characters. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with this game as a kid. This was a game where I could put a team together with Spider-Man, Gambit, Wolverine. It had Cable in it. As a kid, I didn't know who the Capcom characters were. I didn't know who Ryu was. I know that seems crazy, but this was really my first introduction to the Capcom style of fighting games. I didn't grow up in the 90s, so I wasn't there for Street Fighter Fever, but thank God I was there for Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2 being at our local arcade. So we grew up playing Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2 in the arcade, and I love playing it on the Dreamcast. And I'm really thankful that it's getting a re-release. And that's why I think it's one of the best Dreamcast games, one of the most quintessential Dreamcast games. There's been other ports of it on the PS2 and the Xbox, but the fans of the series have always maintained that the most true version is on the Sega Dreamcast because the arcade version is on the Sega Naomi hardware, which is basically a Sega Dreamcast. So the most pure way to play MVC2 is on the Sega Dreamcast. I'm sure the re-release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 will be very true to the arcade game, but I think the appeal of playing Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on the Dreamcast will never truly go away.
I will say that the version being used on the collection is actually the arcade release, which a lot of people who have been waiting for this release to happen are very excited for, mostly in part that the arcade release is generally contested as the best version to play if you're doing it from a competitive perspective. The Dreamcast version, I think, was very, very close in that manner. I think there were just very small technical things that differentiate it from that arcade release that are ever so minor, but so many people who are competitive with this game specifically, and there's a lot of people very specific about this game and what version to play. Many of the glitches and stuff that are on the PS2 and Xbox versions make them generally not as competitive or as competitively interesting in comparison to the Dreamcast and arcade ports.
But for the regular Joes who just want to enjoy some Marvel vs. Capcom action, I'm sure the PS2 and Xbox versions aren't bad ways to play.
No.
I don't have those versions. I think you have played those.
Out of the Japanese release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, I will say one of the most frustrating things about that game is that whenever you want to play that game again, you have to load your save data because it doesn't auto-load. It just sort of just boots up and you're
That's
like,
annoying.
Where are all my characters at? I want to play the game with all the characters unlocked. I did not load it up properly.
That's why we love Marvel vs. Capcom 2, for all those characters. So yeah, these are 9 of the best Dreamcast games that you could ever play. We just wanted to talk about some of our favorite Dreamcast games because we're celebrating 25 years of the North American release of the Sega Dreamcast. And I thank God that the Sega Dreamcast was released in North America so that we could have easy access to play all of these great arcade games and great ports of PS1 games. The Sega Dreamcast and Sega Dreamcast exclusive games like Sonic Adventure and Shenmue.
Games, you know what? They're not too exclusive now that you can play them on a lot of modern hardware these days.
Well, at the time, you could probably argue that for just about anything. You can, there's always a PC release and you could always emulate.
I mean, if we're going the emulation route, then there really is no true exclusive. But, have you ever seen a Mario game on a computer?
No.
That was a trick question. Mario teaches typing. Greatest game ever made.
Man, why'd you have to trick me like that? You made me look like a fool in front of...
Only real gamers on this show.
So anyway, gang, if you want to go and celebrate 25 years of the Sega Dreamcast, these 9 games are all great games that you should really go out and play.
I agree.
So play some Sega Dreamcast today. And have a good night. And God bless you.
Give up. Challenge again.